First to our top story, and a match of the day walkout led to the programme going ahead last night with no commentary and no pundits either.
Yeah, presenters and commentators refused to take part in solidarity with Gary Lineker, who was suspended from the show after he criticised the government's asylum policy on social media, the dreaded Twitter.
Well, the BBC's chief director has apologised to licence fee payers over last night's show, while the Prime Minister said it was a matter for the BBC and not for the government.
Well, let's talk to former BBC executive and presenter Roger Bolton, who can tell us what he makes of it all. It's really good to talk to you this morning, Roger. I mean, has the BBC landed itself in a mess, or is this a star, or a number of stars, whose egos need bringing down to ground a little bit?
Well, just about all of these things, it's certainly in a mess. But I think that fundamentally at the heart of it is a lack of understanding of what impartiality is and a lack of agreement of what it is, and a question of whether, if you have to pay the licence fee, which everybody has to do, you're entitled to be able to say to people, the BBC is not a vehicle for you expressing your personal views. You just tell us what the facts are and we'll keep our views to ourselves. It's this argument about what is impartiality and who must be impartial that is a wider question. Of course, the other thing that's happening here is the political parties, particularly the governing parties, see this as a wonderful opportunity in the culture wars to create trouble and divert attention from the fundamental issue here, which is illegal immigration, which is extraordinarily difficult to deal with.
Now will be, where does the BBC and where does Gary Lineker go from here? Director General Tim Davie, speaking last night on the BBC, he refused to resign. He actually was offering an olive branch out to Gary Lineker. He called him the best sports broadcaster in the world. Do you think they're aware that they might need to back down on this issue?
I think they're in a desperately difficult situation. If they back down, then what happens over the next 18 months up to the general election, when this issue of immigration and asylum is going to dominate the headlines? Gary Lineker won't stop talking about that. Others will want to make their views clear. So that's a nightmare. On the other hand, with a chairman who has close associations with Boris Johnson and who's under investigation and who is silent on this occasion, and a director general who was a former Conservative councillor, that's an extremely difficult situation. I mean, the best thing that would happen is that Gary Lineker accepts at the moment that he will not tweet on this issue. Then there are discussions over the long term about what impartiality is, whether it should apply only to people in news and current affairs, or whether it applies to every presenter on the BBC. Now, the trouble with that is, if you were asked to do a job for the BBC, I hope you are, as well as your present employment, for one day a week or 1 week a year, are you to suppress all your social media activity because you're doing that? It's a fiendishly difficult problem, but the best thing would be to Gary Lineker to say very clearly, I will stop tweeting on these subjects. I will discuss this with the BBC. This is doing too much damage. And the other thing that needs to happen is the BBC chairman now needs to resign. The very fact that he can't speak out on this subject and defend the BBC and define impartiality as the chairman of the BBC means that he can't do his job. So I'm afraid he should go. The Director General should stay. Gary Lineker should say, I'll not comment on this issue for a while anyway while we negotiate it. And we should get Match of the Day back. After all, licence fee payers pay for that, and they didn't get it last night.
No, I mean, as you wonderfully highlight, Roger, it's such a difficult situation. I mean, what I found extraordinary, and it's across a lot of the papers this morning, I won't quit, says BBC boss. I mean, the Director General, this is on the Sunday Telegraph this morning. Gary Lineker is the one who is being criticised, whether rightly or wrongly, and whether the impartiality rules are right or wrong or whatever. He's the one who's come under pressure, and it's the DG who's now being questioned as to whether he'll resign. It seems to have absolutely been turned on its head.
Well, it has, but this is a reflection of our society, because we're having, with the growth of without social media, it was actually quite difficult to get your views heard. Gary Lineker probably could do it. Have to ring up, maybe talk to somebody like you and whatever. Digital media, it takes him about 3 seconds to respond to something. On it goes, bang. It has to be very short, so therefore it's headline stuff. Somebody then piles in, Wonderful. Another person piles in. You've got your row. And if the political parties aren't interested, and neither are actually, in getting into the detail of the problem about illegal immigration and asylum, it's a wonderfully convenient thing. Let's row about this for the next 18 months. The Conservatives in particular will run on this issue. But look, the facts are there were 45,000 UK arrivals in small boats last year. There were 74,000 total UK asylum applications. But in France, there were 180,000. And there are almost 1 million at the EU across the board. It's not an issue we can solve ourselves. It's a massive problem. And the danger is also that we see all of these people as them, other, not as individuals. And once you regard people as the other, you don't have to treat them as human beings. But equally, how do we stop this flow coming in, which is creating massive problems? What we actually need is a national consensus, people to work together and to work with Europe and elsewhere on trying to resolve this situation. Instead, why don't we just play with the social media? Why don't we just attack each other? Why don't, personalities saying it's my right and somebody say it's my right? And off we go. Do we think we're serving the public? Well, by doing this in this way. We're not.
Well, no.
Nobody can be impartial. You have the right. You're an organisation of the perfect right to put opinionated programming on because that's what you're there for, and it's healthy for democracy. But combined with you, what there needs to be is an organisation where you can say, right, they are entirely impartial. They'll provide the facts. Then we'll have a discussion about it. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose that organisation that does give you the facts. And if you look across the water at what's happened with Fox, run by Rupert Murdoch, we now know through the disclosure of documents that they were well aware that Donald Trump had lost the election and that Donald Trump was lying about that. And their presenters went on air and said the opposite, with the encouragement of their leadership, because they didn't want to offend their audience, because that was too important to their business model. Now, that's a warning to us all.
That is a warning to us all. It's about the key is getting all perspectives across and not hampering one side of an argument, isn't it? That's key to all of this. But I think there's got to be
facts out that we can use as the basis of debate.
But then we've got to ask questions, haven't we, about celebrities, whether they're, Gary Lineker's got some experience with asylum because he's taken asylum seekers into his home and all the rest of it. But it raises the question, doesn't it, about celebrities who get involved in politics, all the rest of it, and they have a reach into people's homes and they have a reach into people's lives, a very big platform, but they may be totally uninformed. And isn't there a question in our democracy and about getting all views across that people who happen to have a high profile shouldn't necessarily have that much input into how we think about our everyday lives and our politics?
Well, I agree with you, but you're asking people who are celebrities to be, shall we say, modest about their abilities in other areas. And it's human nature. Look, if I was in Gary Lineker's situation and so on, I'd be very tempted to tweet. Of course I would. It's an egotistical thing, but it's also he feels passionately about things. But it's true, celebrities and people who can kick a football particularly accurately and well do think they therefore should be able to comment about the international politics and the relationships with the former Soviet Union and so on. Of course, we're all a bit arrogant in our views, but we've never before had a ways of expressing our views so easily and quickly, and I would say thoughtlessly. And that's the problem. But that's a fact. You can't alter it. So the question is, do we want somewhere in our society an organisation we can trust to just give us the facts and the analysis while enabling people in a democracy, and free speech should be a central thing we defend, to express their views. The danger now is you've got cowed BBC, which is also getting poorer and poorer. You've got headlines, on Gary Lineker. Who is discussing the extraordinarily difficult decisions about how we deal with asylum seekers? Because whatever any government tells you, you can't stop the boats entirely. And if we look forward to climate change and the impact of climate change, populations will keep moving. And they moved in the 1600s when the religious situation in this area in this country was intolerable, and they went to the United States. In the end of the 19th century, there were waves of people coming from Eastern Europe for persecution. This has always gone on. It will go on again. But we have to have a proper debate about how we're going to control this, how we're going to manage it. And we haven't got that because we're talking about Gary Lineker, who is a great footballer, a wonderful presenter, but really, is he more important than this issue?
Well, the answer to that is very clearly no. Roger, it's very good to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much indeed. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Well, I mean, look, it's an interesting perspective, isn't it? I mean, Roger's comments on the BBC, the chairman needs to go, he says, not because of this, but because he can't comment about it because he's embroiled in this other row over Boris Johnson at the moment. That's a valid point. But he does raise a point, whether you agree with him or not. The idea that we are embroiled in a row over Gary Lineker rather than talking about the issue itself,
At the heart of it all.
I think is actually a very valid point to make. Whichever side of the argument you fall on, actually. Your views would be very welcome on that. GBViews at gbnews.uk.